The first time I realized my marriage was in cardiac arrest. It wasn't because of a lipstick stain or a late-night confession. It was because of an email. Brandon had fallen asleep on the couch, one arm hanging off the edge, the glow of his laptop still lighting the living room in that cold, blue way that makes everything feel clinical. I had just come home from a 12-hour night shift at St. Matthew's Medical Center in Houston. I was used to reading signs most people missed: oxygen levels dipping, a pulse turning irregular, skin changing color by half a shade. I could tell when a body was slipping into shock before the monitors started screaming. That night, the only monitor was his inbox. Equity transfer confirmation, 20% stake, Pacific Horizon Capital. My eyes locked on the number first. 20%. My heart didn't race. It slowed, the way it does when a patient's blood pressure drops too fast. I clicked the email. The documents were attached. Digital signatures. Wire instructions. California fund. Multi-million-dollar valuation. There was no request for my approval. There was no email addressed to me. There was no signature from me. They had sold part of the company, and they had done it without my veto. I didn't wake him. I didn't slam the laptop shut. I stood there in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady sound of his breathing, and I felt something shift. Not heartbreak. Not even rage. Clarity. 3 years earlier, when Brandon's family was raising their first major round of funding for their health tech startup, I had invested every dollar I had saved from years of night shifts and double weekends. The company had started in his parents' garage in Sugar Land, just outside Houston. Back then, it was nothing more than a data integration platform trying to convince hospitals they needed smarter analytics. I believed in it. I believed in him. But I also believed in paperwork. A friend of mine from nursing school had gone into corporate law. Over coffee one Sunday afternoon, she had said, "If you're putting your entire savings into a family business, you need protection." I had insisted on a clause in the shareholder agreement. Any transfer of more than 15% of equity required my written approval as a minority shareholder with veto rights. Brandon's father laughed when I brought it up. His mother called it overly cautious. Brandon kissed my forehead and told me I worried too much. They signed it anyway. I remembered that clause now like a pulse under my fingertips. I walked quietly into our bedroom and knelt beside the closet. The small safe was tucked behind a row of winter coats we rarely used in Texas. My hands didn't shake as I entered the code. Inside was the original notarized shareholder agreement, along with copies of my investment transfer and board correspondence. I sat on the floor and turned to Section 7, Minority Shareholder Protective Provision. Any equity transaction exceeding 15% of issued shares requires written consent from Samantha Collins. My name was there. Clear. Unambiguous. Legally binding. They hadn't asked, which meant they had either forgotten or assumed I wouldn't use it. Over the past 6 months, Brandon had changed in subtle ways. More strategy trips to San Francisco. Closed-door board meetings I wasn't told about. His younger brother suddenly too busy to meet me for coffee. His mother's polite smile turning tight around the edges during Sunday dinners. I had told myself it was stress. Growth pains. The normal tension of scaling a company worth tens of millions of dollars. But I know what denial looks like. I've seen it in patients who ignore chest pain until it becomes irreversible. I went back to the living room and opened the attachments again. The transfer was to a California investment fund. Pacific Horizon Capital. I scanned the term sheet quickly. Then I saw a name. Project lead. Samantha Hayes. 32. Product manager. Brandon had mentioned her before. Brilliant, he'd said. Key to integration. I replayed the last 6 months in my head. Late-night texts. Sudden flights. A perfume I didn't recognize once on his jacket. Faint but real. The kind of detail you only notice when something already feels off. The betrayal wasn't a kiss in a hotel lobby. It was a missing signature. I didn't cry. Instead, I photographed every document on the screen with my phone. I forwarded the email to a private account Brandon didn't know existed. I saved the attached agreements to a secure drive. By the time the sun began rising over Houston, I had already drafted an email. Not to Brandon. To a commercial litigation attorney in downtown Houston whose name my lawyer friend had recommended years ago. Subject line: urgent shareholder violation, veto clause breach. I attached the documents. I wrote one sentence. They executed a 20% equity transfer without my consent. Then I closed the laptop gently and placed it back exactly where I found it. Brandon stirred but didn't wake. He thought he had secured the future of his company. He didn't realize he had just triggered my clause. And in the world of contracts, there is no such thing as a harmless omission. There is only breach. By the time Brandon woke up that morning, I had already finished my shift, showered, and spoken to an attorney. He walked into the kitchen rubbing his eyes, still half asleep, his hair messy, unaware that the ground beneath him had shifted. "You're home early," he said, reaching for the coffee pot. "I switched with someone," I replied evenly. It wasn't a lie. I had switched something. The balance of power. At 9:30, I was sitting across from Daniel Reeves, a commercial litigation attorney whose office overlooked downtown Houston. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Clean desk. Calm voice. He reviewed the documents in silence, his reading glasses low on his nose. 20% is well over the threshold, he said finally. "And there's no written consent from you." "None," I answered. He tapped the agreement with his pen. "Your veto clause is clear. If they proceed with this transfer without curing the breach, it's a violation of shareholder protections, potentially fiduciary misconduct." The words felt clinical, almost sterile. Misconduct. Violation. Breach. In the hospital. Those words meant someone had failed to follow protocol. Here, it meant someone had decided I didn't matter. Daniel leaned back. "We move quickly. We send a formal notice to the company and to the investment fund. Demand immediate suspension of the transaction pending review." "How long do they have to respond?" I asked. "Usually 72 hours. But the fund will freeze everything the moment they realize the deal isn't clean." He studied me for a second. "Are you prepared for this to become public inside the company?" "Yes." I didn't hesitate, because I already knew the alternative. At noon, Daniel's office sent a certified letter to Brandon's company headquarters and an electronic copy to Pacific Horizon Capital in California. Subject line: notice of shareholder consent violation and demand for immediate transaction suspension. I was on my second cup of coffee when my phone rang. "Brandon." I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I answered on the third ring. "What did you send?" His voice wasn't angry. It was tight. "Controlled." "I sent nothing," I said calmly. "My attorney did." There was a pause. "Your attorney?" "Yes." "For what?" "For the 20% equity transfer you forgot to run by me." Silence. Then, "It's strategic capital." "Sam?" "It's not personal. It's contractual," I replied. "And it exceeds 15%. His breath sharpened. "We were going to tell you." "When?" "After the term sheet finalized." So after it was already done. Another silence. I could almost hear him recalculating. "You're overreacting," he said. "This is normal in growth stage companies. Is ignoring a signed veto clause normal?" That was the first crack. "I didn't think you'd use it," he admitted quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was. Not denial. Not confusion. Assumption. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he added quickly. "We just needed to move fast." "We?" I asked. He hesitated again. "The board?" "The board?" "His father, his brother, and somewhere in that circle, Samantha Hayes." By late afternoon, Daniel called with confirmation. "The fund has acknowledged receipt of our notice," he said. "They are suspending all payment transfers until the shareholder consent issue is resolved." How did they react? Very cautiously. No investor wants to close on a disputed cap table, which meant the wire transfer Brandon had been counting on was frozen mid-air. At 6 that evening, Brandon texted me, "Emergency board meeting tomorrow?" You need to be there. Need. I stared at the word for a long time. The next morning, I walked into the company's glass-walled conference room in downtown Houston for the first time in months. I had attended early funding meetings years ago, back when it felt collaborative. This time, the air felt different, tighter. Brandon was already seated at the head of the table. His father sat to his right. His younger brother across from him, the CFO near the projector screen. And at the far end, dialing in remotely from California, was Samantha Hayes. She looked exactly like her LinkedIn photo. Confident, polished, professional. Brandon avoided my eyes. His father spoke first. We received a legal notice from your counsel? Yes, I said evenly. Because the company executed a 20% equity transfer without my written consent. His jaw tightened. It was a strategic necessity. It was a contractual breach. The CFO cleared his throat. Technically, the agreement does require minority consent above 15%. Brandon shot him a look. Samantha's voice came through the speaker. We believed the clause was protective, not prohibitive. The deal timeline was compressed. I turned toward the speaker. Belief doesn't override signed agreements. There was a beat of silence in the room. Brandon finally looked at me. What do you want? It was the first honest question he had asked. I want the transaction suspended until it complies with the agreement, I said. And I want full transparency regarding all board discussions over the past 6 months. His mother's words echoed in my head from past dinners. Family first. Loyalty matters. But loyalty without disclosure is control. His father leaned back heavily. If the fund pulls out, the bank could reconsider the bridge loan. I'm aware, I said quietly. The room shifted. They hadn't expected me to understand leverage. Brandon's voice softened. You're risking the company. No, I replied. You did that when you signed without me? Samantha's image flickered slightly on the screen. If this falls apart, we all lose. I held her gaze through the camera lens. Then you should have read Section 7. The meeting adjourned without resolution. As I stepped out into the Houston sunlight, my phone buzzed again. Daniel, they've requested a 48-hour negotiation window, he said. They're nervous.
Good.
Because for the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was setting the pace. And they were just beginning to realize that my veto wasn't symbolic. It was active. The forensic audit began the same way most crises do in a hospital, quietly, behind closed doors, with professionals who don't blink at uncomfortable truths. Daniel recommended an independent accounting firm that specialized in shareholder disputes. Within 48 hours, they were reviewing internal ledgers, board minutes, reimbursement logs, and capital allocation records. Officially, the company framed it as routine compliance verification for investor reassurance. Unofficially, it was damage control. Brandon barely spoke to me at home. We moved around each other like strangers sharing a lease. He slept in the guest room the second night after the board meeting. I didn't ask him to. He just did. On the third evening, he stood in the kitchen while I washed dishes. You didn't have to bring in auditors, he said, his voice low. I didn't bring them in, I replied. Your violation did. It makes us look unstable. It makes you accountable. His jaw tightened. This is bigger than us. It stopped being about us when you signed without me. He didn't respond. By the end of the week, the auditors had already flagged irregularities. Not fraud. Not yet. But patterns. Daniel invited me to his office again. He slid a printed summary across the table. There are multiple expense reimbursements tied to travel and consulting fees that intersect with the equity negotiation timeline, he said. Some of them were personally approved by Brandon. Define intersect, I asked. Payments labeled as Product Integration Advisory Services. Several tied to Samantha Hayes, LLC. The name didn't sting anymore. It sharpened. Were they legitimate services? I asked. Possibly, but the timing raises governance questions, especially since she was involved in deal structuring. Conflict of interest. In medicine, That's like a surgeon operating on a family member without disclosure. Daniel tapped another page. There's also evidence of internal pressure to close the transaction before full board circulation. Meaning someone didn't want extended review. I already knew who that someone was. At the next board meeting, the tone had shifted. No more dismissive smiles. No more casual reassurances. The CFO presented the audit's preliminary observations with careful language. We are reviewing expense classifications and approval protocols to ensure compliance. Brandon sat stiffly. His father looked 10 years older than he had 2 weeks ago. Samantha dialed in again. Her voice measured. Are these findings formal accusations? No, the CFO replied quickly. They are risk indicators. I spoke calmly. Risk indicators are exactly what we're trying to prevent. Brandon finally looked at me directly. You're making it sound criminal. I'm making it sound procedural, I said. You bypassed a shareholder protection clause. His brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We didn't think you'd escalate this. That was your first mistake. The room fell silent. Later that afternoon, Daniel called with another update. The investment fund has requested written confirmation that your veto rights have been addressed, he said. They're uneasy. Good. There's more, he added. The bank financing the bridge loan has asked for updated capitalization tables, which meant the bank now knew something was off. The bridge loan had been secured personally by Brandon's father. If the deal collapsed and liquidity tightened, that guarantee would be tested. This wasn't just corporate embarrassment anymore. It was inheritance. That evening, Brandon's mother called me. Her tone was softer than it had been in months. Can we talk privately? We met at a quiet cafe in Sugarland, the same area where the company had started in their garage. You're tearing the family apart, she said gently, stirring her tea without drinking it. I'm enforcing a contract, I replied. This was supposed to secure your future too. By excluding me, she looked down. Brandon said you wouldn't understand the urgency. I let out a slow breath. I invested my entire savings into this company. I understand risk. She reached across the table. If this goes public, it will damage everything. It already did, I said quietly. Back home, Brandon confronted me in the hallway. What do you actually want? He demanded. Money. Control. I want governance to mean something. He laughed once, bitterly. You're enjoying this. I stared at him. Do you think I enjoy discovering you signed a multimillion-dollar transfer behind my back? His eyes flickered. And do you think I didn't notice your trips to California? I added softly. He froze. You're mixing issues, he said. No, I replied. You did? 2 days later, the auditors issued a supplemental note. They had found reimbursement entries tied to a private advisory session billed at an inflated rate under Samantha Hayes' consulting entity. The amount wasn't catastrophic, but it was deliberate. Daniel's voice was calm when he explained it. This increases leverage. It suggests potential fiduciary breach. So what's the next step? We prepare a formal breach notice, and we consider filing a claim that night. I sat alone in the living room where it had started. The laptop sat closed on the coffee table. The house felt quieter than usual. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors or shatter plates. It documents. It timestamps. It preserves evidence. And then it moves when the timing is precise. Brandon thought the veto clause was a technicality. He was beginning to understand it was structural. And structures, once cracked, don't fail quietly. They collapse under their own weight. The preliminary audit report landed on Daniel's desk exactly 7 days after the board meeting. And by the time he called me, I already knew it wouldn't be minor. They've confirmed multiple approvals signed directly by Brandon, he said. Travel reimbursements, consulting invoices, strategic integration payments. The pattern is consistent. Consistent how? I asked. Consistent with someone accelerating a deal timeline and bypassing extended oversight. I stood in the hospital supply room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. boxes of IV tubing stacked around me. My shift had just ended, but I didn't feel tired. Anything tied directly to Samantha Hayes? I asked. There are payments to her LLC during the negotiation window. Nothing blatantly illegal yet, but it supports the narrative of conflict. Narrative. In medicine, you call it clinical history. In court, you call it a story supported by evidence. Prepare the breach notice, I said. Daniel paused for half a second. You're certain? Yes. By afternoon, formal documentation was drafted. Notice of breach of fiduciary duty. Notice of shareholder protection violation. Demand for immediate governance review. The language was cold and precise. No emotion. Just facts. Brandon found out before dinner. He didn't call. He walked into the house already knowing. You filed a breach notice? He asked. Standing in the doorway of the kitchen. I initiated it. You're escalating this into litigation. You escalated it when you signed. His hands clenched briefly at his sides. This will destroy investor confidence. Investor confidence was already damaged when they discovered the consent issue. He shook his head. You're turning this into revenge. I set my fork down carefully. If this were revenge, I would have gone public already. The next morning, the board scheduled an emergency session. This time, there were no casual greetings. No small talk. The CFO's face was drawn tight. Daniel attended as my legal counsel. Brandon's father began, voice heavy. We've received a formal breach notice. This is serious. It should be, I said evenly. The CFO cleared his throat and projected the audit summary on the screen. Findings indicate expedited approval processes and potential governance lapses during equity negotiations. He read carefully. Brandon cut in. Potential is not proof. Daniel spoke calmly. Potential fiduciary violation requires corrective action. That's standard governance protocol. Samantha's image appeared on the screen again, joining remotely. This is disproportionate, she said. The company needed fast capital. Everyone understood the urgency. Everyone except the minority shareholder whose signature was required. Daniel replied. A silence spread across the room like pressure building in a sealed chamber. Then the CFO added something new. The bank has requested a compliance review of our capitalization structure. Brandon's father went pale. The bridge loan had been personally guaranteed by him. If the equity infusion failed and the bank sensed instability, they could accelerate repayment, which meant collateral, which meant family assets. Brandon turned to me. Do you understand what you're risking? I understand exactly what you risked when you assumed I wouldn't enforce my rights. The meeting ended without resolution. That afternoon, Daniel called with an update. The California Fund has suspended negotiations indefinitely, he said. They're labeling the deal governance unstable. And the bank, they've set a deadline for documentation review. If they're not satisfied, they could reconsider loan terms, which meant time was shrinking. That evening, Brandon requested a private meeting. We sat at opposite ends of the dining table. I can fix this, he said. Withdraw the breach claim. We'll renegotiate your role. Increase your dividend percentage. I'm not negotiating dividends, I said quietly. I'm enforcing accountability. He leaned forward. Then what do you want? Transparency and structural reform. He laughed once. You think you can just rewrite governance because you're angry? I'm not angry. And I wasn't. Anger is loud. This felt clinical. 2 days later, Daniel delivered the supplemental audit findings. There's a private advisory session billed at a rate significantly above standard market value, he said. Approved by Brandon personally. Linked to Samantha. Yes. He let that settle. This strengthens a fiduciary breach argument, he continued. It shows potential preferential treatment tied to someone involved in the equity negotiation. The implications were obvious. If the board ignored this, they exposed themselves. If they acknowledged it, Brandon's position weakened. The next board session was shorter but heavier. The CFO recommended establishing a temporary oversight committee. Brandon objected immediately. This is unnecessary. His brother spoke quietly for the first time. Maybe it's not? Brandon stared at him. His father avoided eye contact. Samantha's connection dropped briefly before she rejoined, her voice less steady than before. We're overcorrecting, she insisted. No, I said calmly. We're correcting. The vote to initiate governance review passed narrowly. Brandon's executive authority was temporarily limited pending investigation. It wasn't removal. Not yet. But it was fracture. That night, Brandon stood in the hallway again. You're dismantling everything, he said. No, I replied. I'm preventing collapse. He looked at me like he was seeing someone unfamiliar. Maybe he thought I was the quiet investor who signed checks and stayed out of boardrooms. He forgot I spent my nights managing emergencies without panic. And this was just another emergency. Only this time. The patient wasn't a person. It was a company built on assumptions. And the assumption that I would stay silent was the most dangerous symptom of all. The suspension vote happened on a Thursday afternoon, and it felt less like a dramatic coup and more like a clinical decision. The board gathered in the same glass conference room overlooking downtown Houston. The skyline shimmered in the heat, indifferent to what was about to shift inside that room. The motion was simple on paper. Temporary suspension of Brandon Collins' executive authority pending full governance review. Interim Operations Committee to oversee financial and strategic decisions. It wasn't termination. It was containment. Brandon sat at the head of the table, but the position no longer looked permanent. His shoulders were stiff, jaw locked, eyes sharp with restrained anger. His father spoke first. This is precautionary, he said. Not punitive. Brandon didn't respond. The CFO presented the audit summary again, this time more direct. Given the ongoing shareholder consent dispute and preliminary findings regarding reimbursement approvals, temporary restructuring protects the company's stability. Protects the company. Not the marriage. Not the family. The company. Brandon finally spoke. You're reacting to noise. Daniel responded calmly from beside me. Investors and lenders do not consider governance violations noise. The vote was called. Hands rose slowly. His brother's hand lifted. One independent board member followed. Then, after a long pause that felt heavier than any silence I'd experienced in an operating room, his father raised his hand. 3-1. Brandon's authority was suspended. For a moment, no one moved. He didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, as if still calculating how to reverse it. The interim committee was announced immediately. The CFO, an external advisor, and me, as shareholder oversight. The word oversight echoed in my mind. That evening, industry whispers began circulating faster than official statements. By Friday morning, one of the company's largest hospital clients had requested written reassurance of operational continuity. They cited governance concerns. By afternoon, Pacific Horizon Capital formally terminated the equity deal. The 20% sale was void. The bridge loan bank responded within hours. They scheduled a compliance review and requested updated capitalization tables, executive authority documentation, and proof of oversight measures. Translation: they were deciding whether to tighten the leash. At home, Brandon packed a suitcase. Where are you going? I asked quietly. To stay at the apartment downtown for a while, he replied. Because of me. Because of this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the house. The house that had once felt like shared investment. Now it felt like divided territory. On Saturday morning, the board convened again, this time with urgency. Revenue forecasts were adjusted. Cash flow projections recalculated without the expected infusion from California. The CFO's voice was tight. If the bank accelerates repayment, liquidity will tighten significantly. Brandon's father rubbed his temples. We cannot let this spiral. Samantha Hayes dialed in but looked different this time. Less confident. More defensive. This is reputational overreaction, she insisted. The deal would have stabilized everything. It would have stabilized nothing if it was legally defective. Daniel replied, A new issue surfaced. The auditors had found that certain stock option allocations were structured to activate upon deal closure, including a tranche tied to Samantha's performance metrics. Her image froze for half a second on the screen. "I followed board directives," she said. "Without verified minority consent," Daniel added. By Monday, Human Resources initiated a formal conflict of interest review regarding her involvement in financial forecasting and equity structuring. Brandon tried to regain footing. He requested a private meeting with 2 board members. He framed the suspension as overreach fueled by marital conflict. But the narrative had shifted. This was no longer about a marriage unraveling. It was about fiduciary exposure. That night, he called me from downtown. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "You froze capital. You triggered compliance reviews. You humiliated me. I enforced a contract." He exhaled sharply. "You're enjoying this." I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm protecting my investment." There was a long pause. "I never thought you'd use the clause," he admitted quietly. "That was your mistake." On Wednesday, the bank sent formal notice. Acceleration of review timeline. Failure to demonstrate governance stability could result in revised loan terms. Brandon's father's personal guarantee now hovered like a shadow over every conversation. Inheritance, legacy, reputation. All of it tied to one missing signature. By the end of the week, Samantha Hayes was placed on administrative leave pending review. Her company email access was restricted. Her name removed from active strategic planning threads. No scandal. No press release. Just quiet isolation. Brandon's brother approached me after the board session. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "Neither did I," I replied. "But you're not backing down." "No," he nodded slowly. "Maybe we needed this." The statement surprised me. Maybe they did. Because what had started as a hidden equity transfer had exposed something deeper. They believed governance was flexible when family controlled the board. They believed loyalty replaced documentation. They believed I would choose silence over structure. They were wrong. On Friday afternoon, the Oversight Committee held its first formal review session. I sat at the table not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone reading vitals. Cash flow, debt ratio, operational stability. The company wasn't dead, but it had been operating with an untreated condition, and now the infection was visible. Brandon stood outside the glass wall during the meeting, watching but not participating. For the first time since this began, he looked uncertain. Not angry, not arrogant, uncertain. They had tried to sell 20% of the company without me. Now they were fighting to keep control of what remained. And this time, every decision required my signature. Brandon offered to buy me out 3 days after the bank accelerated its compliance review. He didn't come home to say it. He invited me to lunch at a quiet steakhouse near the Galleria. The kind of place executives choose when they want privacy without secrecy. "You look tired," he said when I sat down. "I work night shifts," I replied. "I'm supposed to..." He didn't smile. After the waiter left, he leaned forward. "I want to resolve this." "So do I. I mean permanently." There it was. "I'll buy your shares," he said. "At a premium? Above last valuation? You walk away clean. No more oversight. No more breach claims." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a drafted settlement framework. Lump sum payout. Non-disclosure agreement. Voluntary waiver of veto rights. They didn't want peace. They wanted control back. "You'd remove my veto clause entirely," I said quietly. "It's become a weapon. It's a protection. It's freezing growth. It's freezing misconduct." His jaw tightened. "This is revenge. If it were revenge, I'd be speaking to reporters." He exhaled slowly. "You're going to tank the company." "I'm going to prevent it from being mismanaged." He leaned back. "What would it take?" "Transparency," I said. "And governance reform." "That's not realistic. It's non-negotiable." By the time we left, he knew I wouldn't sell. 2 days later, I filed for divorce. Texas Family Court. Grounds cited. Breach of fiduciary trust and financial misconduct intertwined with marital assets. Daniel coordinated with a family law specialist. We ensured the divorce petition referenced corporate financial irregularities carefully, without exaggeration. Because discovery would now expand. Brandon received notice at the office. He called immediately. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Yes, I did. This drags everything into court. You dragged corporate funds into personal secrecy?" He went quiet. Discovery began within weeks. Financial disclosures revealed accounts I hadn't seen before. Personal brokerage accounts tied to consulting inflows. Transfers labeled strategic advisory fees. One account linked to a limited liability entity registered in Nevada. Daniel reviewed the statements with me in his office. "These overlap with reimbursement timelines," he said. "Some funds were moved within 48 hours of internal approvals. Were they illegal? Potentially commingled. That's enough to apply pressure. Pressure. It was building everywhere. The California Fund formally withdrew from negotiations, citing unresolved governance instability. The bank set a compliance deadline. The board began discussing recapitalization strategies. And in the middle of it all, divorce settlement negotiations intensified. Brandon's attorney proposed an expedited resolution, confidential payout, structured asset division, clause limiting public discussion of corporate misconduct. I rejected it immediately. "I will not sign silence," I told my lawyer. At the next board meeting, recapitalization proposals were presented. If the California money was gone, shareholders would need to inject capital or accept dilution. Brandon's father assumed I would decline. If I refused to contribute, they could reduce my percentage. He miscalculated. "I'm willing to participate in recapitalization," I said calmly, "under revised governance terms." The room shifted. "What terms?" his brother asked. "Formal oversight committee. Dual signature requirement for equity transfers. Mandatory disclosure of related party transactions." Silence. The CFO spoke cautiously. "Those reforms could reassure the bank." Brandon stared at me. "You're restructuring the company." "I'm protecting my investment." The divorce hearing arrived quietly. No dramatic shouting. Just legal language and controlled statements. Brandon's attorney argued that corporate matters were separate from marital breakdown. My counsel countered that undisclosed financial decisions intertwined the two. The judge ordered expanded financial disclosure. Outside the courthouse, Brandon stopped me. "You're destroying my reputation," he said. "I'm exposing your decisions. You could have handled this privately. You could have included me." He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't think you'd fight like this. I didn't think I'd have to." That night, alone in the house, I felt the weight of it. Not anger, not triumph. Responsibility. Revenge stories are loud in movies. In real life, they look like spreadsheets and legal filings. They look like a woman reading the fine print she insisted on years earlier. They look like refusing to sign away silence. By the end of the month, Brandon's legal team requested mediation. Not to reconcile the marriage, to contain exposure. But containment requires consent. And this time, consent meant my signature. The veto clause had frozen the equity deal. The divorce filing had expanded discovery. And the oversight reforms were now the only path to financial stabilization. They thought I would take a payout and disappear. They didn't understand that walking away would mean admitting I was only ever a supporting character. I wasn't. I was written into the structure. And structures, once reinforced, don't bend easily, not even under family pressure. The secondary audit report arrived on a Monday morning while I was charting medication doses at the hospital. Daniel's name lit up on my phone. "They've completed the expanded review," he said without preamble. "And it's more significant than we expected." I stepped into an empty consultation room and closed the door behind me. "Tell me." "There are multiple reimbursement approvals personally signed by Brandon that coincide with deal acceleration phases. Travel, advisory sessions, strategic integration planning, Several payments went to Samantha Hayes' consulting entity during negotiation windows. My pulse stayed steady. Is it actionable? I asked. Yes. It strengthens a breach of fiduciary duty claim, especially because some approvals bypassed extended board review. I leaned against the counter, staring at the sterile white walls. Draft the formal breach claim, I said. There was a short silence on the line. You're moving from defensive freeze to offensive litigation, Daniel said carefully. I know. By afternoon, the formal claim was filed. Not publicly yet, but served internally. Notice of intent to pursue shareholder fraud and fiduciary violation. The language was precise. It outlined patterns, timelines, overlapping financial flows. It didn't accuse emotion. It accused structure. Brandon came home that evening. He didn't yell. He walked straight into the living room and stood across from me. You're filing fraud claims now? He asked. I'm filing breach claims. You're going nuclear. I'm following the evidence. He ran a hand over his face. If this becomes public, hospital partners will panic. Then perhaps governance should have been clean. His voice dropped. We can fix this quietly. We had that option before you signed. The next morning, Pacific Horizon Capital requested a written explanation from the board. They wanted assurance that minority consent violations had been cured and that no undisclosed conflicts of interest remained. The CFO forwarded the inquiry to all board members. The subject line alone felt heavy. Governance clarification required. Inside the company, rumors spread quickly. Employees noticed Brandon's absence from executive calls. Samantha Hayes stopped appearing in strategy threads. An internal memo circulated reminding staff of confidentiality protocols. Confidentiality. The word sounded fragile. That week, Brandon asked to meet privately again, this time at the house. I'll buy you out, he said, pacing the living room. Higher than market value. Cash. Clean exit. You already tried that. This time it's serious. So am I? You're risking the entire company for principal. I'm risking nothing. You already did. He stopped pacing. Do you even care what happens to it? I care that it's governed properly. He stared at me. This is about her. Isn't it? It was the first time he said it out loud without saying her name. This is about you signing without me, I replied evenly. His silence told me enough. By Thursday, the bank sent formal notice of compliance review acceleration. They requested updated cap tables and board authority documentation within 10 business days. Failure to comply could trigger loan reassessment, which meant collateral exposure. Brandon's father requested a private meeting. We met in his office at the original company location in Sugarland. The garage now converted into a symbolic conference space. I built this with my hands, he said quietly. You're threatening everything. I invested everything I had, I replied. You're pushing too far. No, I'm enforcing what you signed. He sighed heavily. If the bank pulls back, we may have to restructure ownership, then restructure it transparently. He looked at me for a long moment. You're not backing down. No. Back at the main office. The board convened again. The CFO recommended formalizing a temporary financial oversight committee immediately. This reassures the bank and signals governance reform, he said. Brandon objected. We don't need another layer. We do, his brother said quietly. The vote passed. Oversight committee established. Brandon's operational authority remained suspended. Samantha Hayes was placed on administrative leave pending the conflict of interest review. An internal email confirmed it. Her corporate access was limited. No public scandal. Just quiet removal from influence. That night, Brandon stood in the hallway again. You're dismantling everything, he said, voice strained. No. I answered. You dismantled trust. I'm repairing structure. He laughed once. Hollow. You're enjoying watching me fall. I'm watching governance stabilize. His eyes hardened. You think this makes you powerful? No, I said softly. It makes me protected. The difference mattered. By the end of the week, The board received unofficial feedback from the California Fund. They labeled the company governance unstable but potentially recoverable under structural reform, which meant this wasn't a death sentence. It was a reset. Late that night, Brandon called from downtown. "You don't have to keep going," he said quietly. "We can settle." "We already are," I replied. "By destroying me." "By correcting you." He exhaled sharply. "I never thought you'd use that clause. I never thought I'd need to." There was a long silence. "I underestimated you," he said finally. "Yes," I answered. After I hung up, I sat alone in the living room. The house was still. The documents were filed. The claims were active. The oversight committee was operational. They had tried to move quickly, quietly, assuming I would prioritize marriage over governance. They forgot I work in emergencies. And in emergencies, hesitation costs lives. In this case, hesitation would have cost me everything. They thought I was reacting emotionally. They didn't realize I was restructuring the battlefield. And once the battlefield shifts, it never returns to what it was. The California Fund's withdrawal became official on a gray Tuesday morning. The email from Pacific Horizon Capital was brief, polite, and final. Due to unresolved governance concerns and minority shareholder consent disputes, we are terminating negotiations effective immediately. 20% of projected capital vanished in 3 sentences. By the time the board convened that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to controlled alarm. The CFO projected updated cash flow forecasts on the screen. "Without the infusion," he said carefully, "we must implement a recapitalization plan within 30 days to avoid liquidity strain." Liquidity strain. A phrase that sounds clinical until you understand it means pressure. Brandon sat 2 seats away from me, no longer at the head of the table. His executive badge had been replaced with board member on the printed agenda. His father's hands were folded tightly. "We can bridge internally," Brandon said. "Short-term financing." The CFO shook his head. "The bank has accelerated its compliance review. Any new financing will require demonstration of governance stabilization." Governance stabilization. That meant me. That meant oversight. That meant structural reform. The compliance review meeting with the bank was scheduled for Friday. In preparation, the oversight committee met daily. Cap tables were updated. Approval hierarchies were redrawn. Dual signature policies drafted. Every document that once moved casually now moved deliberately. On Wednesday afternoon, Human Resources issued formal notice that Samantha Hayes was under review for potential conflict of interest violations. Her email access was restricted. Her role in financial forecasting temporarily suspended. No announcement to the press. No headlines. Just quiet distancing. I received a forwarded internal memo by accident, or perhaps intentionally, from the CFO. Subject line: Risk Exposure Assessment. It referenced potential liability exposure if fiduciary lapses were not corrected. The word liability carries weight. It implies consequence. That evening, Brandon called. "You've made your point," he said. "I didn't make a point. I enforced a contract. The fund is gone. The bank is circling. How much further do you need to push? As far as governance requires." He was silent for a moment. "You're going to bring the entire company down just to win." "I don't need to win," I said. "I need compliance." Friday's bank meeting felt like walking into a critical care unit. 3 representatives joined via video. They requested detailed explanations of the consent dispute, audit findings, and oversight measures. The CFO presented the reforms calmly. Dual authorization for equity transfers, independent audit committee, mandatory disclosure of related party transactions. I spoke only once. The minority consent clause was breached. I said evenly. "We have corrected procedural gaps to ensure it cannot happen again." The lead banker nodded slowly. "We will suspend acceleration pending continued compliance," he said. Suspension, not forgiveness, but time. After the call ended, the board sat in silence. It was Brandon's brother who spoke first. Maybe this needed to happen. Brandon didn't respond. Later that afternoon, the recapitalization proposal was introduced. To maintain liquidity, existing shareholders would inject capital proportionate to their ownership or face dilution. There was an assumption in the room that I would decline, that I would step back. I didn't. I'm prepared to participate, I said calmly. Under revised governance terms. His father looked at me sharply. You're willing to reinvest? Yes. The room shifted again. What terms? Brandon asked. Formal oversight authority codified in bylaws. Permanent compliance committee. Written acknowledgement of minority veto enforcement. That's excessive, he said. It's preventative. The CFO spoke carefully. These reforms would strengthen investor confidence. The vote to adopt governance reforms passed narrowly. Brandon remained suspended from executive authority. Samantha Hayes submitted her resignation the following Monday. The announcement framed it as a mutual professional decision. No scandal. No spectacle. Just absence. At home. Brandon packed the last of his things. I never thought it would end like this, he said quietly. It didn't have to, I replied. You're satisfied now. I looked at him steadily. Satisfied isn't the word. What is protected? He studied me for a long moment. You're different. No, I said softly. I'm the same. You just didn't see me. After he left, the house felt quieter than it ever had. Not empty, just clear. The company stabilized gradually over the next 2 weeks. Clients received formal reassurance letters. Compliance reports were submitted to the bank. Operational continuity continued under interim leadership. The company did not collapse. It recalibrated. Brandon sent one final message late that night. You didn't have to humiliate me. I stared at the text for a long moment before responding. I didn't humiliate you. I enforced a signature. I put my phone down and turned off the lights. They tried to sell 20% of the company without me. Now they were negotiating just to preserve what remained. The difference wasn't revenge. It was leverage. And leverage only matters when you're willing to use it. The first divorce hearing felt colder than any board meeting. Family court doesn't have glass walls or skyline views. It has beige paint, fluorescent lighting, and rows of strangers waiting to untangle their lives. Brandon stood across the hallway from me, speaking quietly with his attorney. He looked composed, but the tightness in his jaw told me everything I needed to know. Our case was called just after 10 in the morning. Inside the courtroom, the language shifted from corporate to personal. Community property, asset disclosure, marital estate. But the lines between marriage and business had already blurred. Brandon's attorney began by arguing that corporate disputes should remain separate from divorce proceedings. This is a private company governance matter, she said smoothly. It should not influence asset division. My attorney responded calmly. When marital funds and undisclosed transfers intersect with corporate accounts, separation is impossible. The judge listened without expression. Then discovery documents were presented. Personal brokerage accounts I had never seen. Transfers labeled as strategic advisory compensation. One account tied to a limited liability entity in Nevada. The timing overlapped with the equity negotiations. Brandon shifted in his seat. These were legitimate consulting payments. His attorney insisted. Payments that coincided with equity acceleration efforts. My attorney countered. Without minority shareholder consent. The judge ordered expanded financial disclosure. Not dramatic, just procedural. But procedure can be lethal when someone has something to hide. Outside the courtroom, Brandon caught up to me. You didn't have to bring corporate issues into this, he said quietly. You did when you moved funds without transparency. I was protecting the company. You were protecting yourself. He shook his head. You're turning this into a public spectacle. No, I said. I'm refusing to shield it. A week later, settlement discussions began privately. Brandon's team proposed a lump sum payout, division of property, and a confidentiality clause limiting public discussion of corporate misconduct. The number was substantial. Financial security in exchange for silence. I read the clause twice. I slid it back across the table. No. His attorney frowned slightly. It's a generous settlement. It requires silence. That protects both parties. It protects governance violations. The room went still. My attorney leaned forward. Our client will not waive her right to pursue further civil remedies if misconduct is substantiated. Brandon finally spoke. You're going to ruin everything, he said quietly. I didn't sign without you, I replied. Discovery continued. The forensic auditor submitted an addendum. Improper reimbursement approvals. Inflated advisory sessions. Timing overlaps between corporate and personal accounts. Not criminal charges, but risk exposure. Risk exposure in corporate governance can cost more than scandal. It can cost credibility. Meanwhile, the industry began whispering. A healthcare tech blog published a short article referencing leadership instability at a Houston-based data platform. No names, but insiders knew. Samantha Hayes quietly resigned from her next professional opportunity before it even began. Her LinkedIn updated with seeking new opportunities. Consequences rarely look dramatic. They look like doors closing quietly. December arrived. Christmas lights appeared on houses across Sugar Land and Houston suburbs. For the first time in years, I did not attend Brandon's family holiday dinner. Instead, I spent the evening at a small gathering hosted by a colleague from the hospital. There were simple decorations, soft music, laughter that didn't feel strained. For the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that I didn't have to pretend. Relief that tradition no longer dictated silence. That night, Brandon's mother called. "You fractured this family," she said, voice heavy with disappointment. "No," I answered gently. "It fractured when decisions were made without me. You could still settle this quietly. I tried to handle it privately. You escalated it. I enforced it. Silence." Even she understood the difference. In January, Brandon's legal team reached out again. They were willing to accept most of my settlement terms. Full retention of my shares. Clear financial separation. No confidentiality clause shielding governance matters. But there was one request. A concession. They asked that I agree not to vote in favor of permanently removing Brandon as CEO at the upcoming shareholder meeting. They wanted assurance. Leverage in exchange for peace. I read the proposal slowly. My divorce decision was now directly tied to corporate leadership. Marriage and business had fused so tightly that separation required precision. That evening, Brandon called. "If you vote against me, I lose everything," he said. "You didn't lose everything," I replied. "You lost control." "That's the same thing." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." He was silent. "Do you regret it?" I asked finally. "The deal," he said. "No." "Signing without me?" There was a long pause. "I didn't think you'd fight like this," he admitted. That wasn't the question. He didn't answer. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was no longer tense. It was empty. The veto clause had frozen the equity sale. The oversight reforms had stabilized the company. The divorce had exposed the hidden accounts. And now, one vote would determine whether Brandon returned to power. They wanted to separate marriage from business. But they were the ones who fused betrayal with governance. And now, my signature carried weight in both courtrooms. The morning of the shareholder vote felt like the calm before a high-risk procedure. I woke before sunrise. The sky over Houston still dark. The city quiet in that suspended hour before traffic begins. I had signed the final divorce papers the day before. My last name remained the same. But the legal ties were severed. Financial separation complete. Shares retained. Veto rights intact. Brandon texted at 6:30. "We can still fix this." I didn't respond. By 9 o'clock, I was walking into the downtown office building again. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and coffee. The receptionist nodded at me with a different kind of respect than before. Not warmth. Recognition. Inside the boardroom, every seat was filled. Independent advisors. Bank observers. Legal counsel. The interim CEO. Brandon sat near the end of the table, no longer at the head. He wore a navy suit and a controlled expression, but his eyes flicked toward me when I entered. The agenda was printed neatly in front of each person. Special shareholder vote. Executive leadership restructuring. The interim CEO opened the meeting. Today's motion concerns the permanent removal of Brandon Collins as Chief Executive Officer and the continuation of governance reforms enacted during the suspension period. The language was formal, clean. Brandon stood to speak. This company was built from nothing, he began. From a garage in Sugarland. We built software that hospitals rely on. We've made mistakes in execution. But we have not committed fraud. No one interrupted. I ask you to consider stability, he continued. Continuity. Loyalty. His father looked down at the table. His brother's face was unreadable. Then Brandon looked at me directly. This isn't about governance, he said quietly. It's about personal conflict. The room shifted slightly. I didn't raise my voice. This is about fiduciary duty, I said. You signed a transfer exceeding 15% without required consent. That is not personal. That is contractual. Silence followed. The interim CEO reviewed the reforms implemented over the past months. Dual signature requirement for equity transactions. Independent Compliance Committee. Mandatory disclosure of related party financial relationships. Formal minority shareholder protections codified into updated bylaws. The bank representative spoke briefly. Continued lending support is contingent upon stable governance. Stable governance. Not emotional reconciliation. Not legacy. Structure. The motion was called. Ballots were distributed. Shareholders marked their votes quietly. I held mine for a moment longer than necessary. 2 years ago, I had insisted on a clause no one believed I would use. Today, I was deciding whether the man who dismissed it would return to control. I marked my vote. Collected ballots were counted by legal counsel. The interim CEO cleared his throat. The motion passes. Permanent removal. Brandon's executive authority was terminated. He retained minority equity, but operational control was gone. His brother had voted in favor. His father had abstained. I did not look at Brandon. He stood slowly. No dramatic outburst. No argument. Just a nod. Tight and controlled. The meeting moved on to appointing the interim executive permanently. Transition timelines. Compliance checkpoints. Stability assurances for hospital clients. It felt procedural. Almost anticlimactic. Afterward, as people filed out, Brandon approached me. You won, he said quietly. This wasn't a competition. You used the clause to take everything. I used the clause to enforce balance. He studied me for a long moment. I never thought you'd choose business over us. I chose integrity. He didn't argue. Outside, the air was humid and bright. I moved into a small apartment near the medical center that week. Close to the hospital. Close to routine. I kept working night shifts. I liked the predictability of IV drips and patient charts. In medicine, protocols exist for a reason. When you ignore them, people suffer. The company began stabilizing under new leadership. The bank withdrew its acceleration threat. Clients renewed contracts cautiously. The California fund remained withdrawn but hinted at possible reconsideration under strengthened governance. Samantha Hayes had already resigned and moved on to another startup out of state. No scandal followed her. No public implosion. Just quiet repositioning. I didn't seek to destroy her. I sought to enforce structure. One evening, Brandon asked to meet one final time. We sat at a neutral cafe downtown. I underestimated you, he said without preamble. Yes, I replied. I thought you wouldn't pull the trigger. It wasn't a trigger. It was a clause. He almost smiled at that. I never meant to exclude you, he said. You did. He nodded once. There was nothing else to argue. No more board votes. No more legal filings. Just consequences. When I left the cafe, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Completion. They thought my veto was symbolic. A technicality inserted by an anxious nurse who didn't understand growth strategy. They forgot that structure matters more than charisma, and signatures matter more than promises. I never lost my vote. I just waited until it mattered. 2 years later, I was back in the ICU at 3 a.m, adjusting a ventilator setting while the monitors hummed in steady rhythm. The patient stabilized within minutes. Crisis contained. There's a strange comfort in controlled emergencies. You identify the problem. You follow protocol. You act. Corporate collapse had felt different. There were no monitors screaming when Brandon signed without me. No flashing alarms when equity shifted hands. The warning signs were subtle. Behavioral. Financial. Emotional. And I almost missed them. During my break, I checked my email. Board advisory update. The subject line was formal now. Not Samantha. Not Sam. Samantha Collins. Advisory member. The company had stabilized under new leadership. Revenue projections were modest but steady. The compliance committee met quarterly. Every equity discussion began with an explicit review of minority shareholder protections. My veto clause was no longer treated like an inconvenience. It was treated like policy. I still held my shares. I still retained my veto rights. But I no longer attended meetings out of fear. I attended them out of clarity. Brandon retained minority equity as well. He had launched a small consulting venture focused on software architecture. Nothing public. Nothing aggressive. Quiet work. I heard about it through industry contacts. No scandal followed him either. Just recalibration. One evening, I received notice that Brandon had submitted a formal proposal to serve in a limited advisory capacity to the company. No executive authority. No financial approvals. Strict compliance monitoring. The board asked for my input. Not because I was his former wife. Because I was a shareholder. 2 years earlier, they had tried to move forward without my signature. Now they wouldn't proceed without it. I attended a charity fundraiser hosted by the company later that month. It was held at a hospital foundation event downtown. The ballroom was softly lit, filled with physicians, executives, donors. Brandon approached me cautiously. "You look well," he said. "I am." He hesitated. I submitted the advisory proposal. "I know. I'm not asking for control," he added quickly. "Just contribution. You'll be evaluated like any other advisor," I replied. There was no anger in my voice, just neutrality. He nodded slowly. I deserved what happened. It was the first time he had said it without qualification. I deserved accountability. He corrected. "Yes," I said. "Not humiliation. Not destruction. Accountability." We stood in silence for a moment before parting. Later that week, the compliance officer sent a draft of updated governance safeguards. Dual authorization for any transaction exceeding 10%. Mandatory external audit triggers. Explicit documentation of minority consent for equity changes. One section caught my attention. All significant equity transfers subject to written approval by Samantha Collins. My name printed clearly in black ink. Not as a favor. As structure. I closed the document and sat back. 2 years earlier, that same name had been treated like a formality. Now it was embedded in policy. I moved apartments again that spring, choosing a slightly larger place closer to a park. I began mentoring younger nurses about financial literacy during informal coffee breaks. Read what you sign. I would tell them, and understand what it means. They laughed sometimes, thinking I was exaggerating. I wasn't. Samantha Hayes had relocated out of state. I saw her name appear briefly in an industry newsletter tied to a new startup. No controversy mentioned. No footnotes referencing Houston. Consequences aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet shifts in trajectory. At the next shareholder meeting, Brandon's advisory proposal was formally discussed. The interim CEO summarized it succinctly. Technical advisory role. No voting power. Subject to compliance oversight. The board looked to me. Does this present a governance risk? One independent member asked. No, I said evenly. Not under the current safeguards. They nodded. The vote would proceed at the next meeting. As I left the building that day, I realized something had changed inside me. 2 years ago, I fought to protect my rights. Now, I was evaluating decisions without emotion clouding judgment. My veto had once been defensive. Now it was structural. Brandon caught up with me near the elevator. "I know my future here depends on your vote," he said quietly. "It depends on policy," I corrected. He almost smiled. "You always were more precise than I gave you credit for. Precision saves lives. In hospitals. In contracts. In marriages." He extended his hand. I shook it. No bitterness. No reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. They once tried to erase my consent from a multi-million-dollar decision. Now they waited for it. And this time, my decision wouldn't be about survival. It would be about principle. I walked back into the boardroom 2 years after everything collapsed. And this time no one underestimated me. The skyline outside the glass walls looked the same. But the energy in the room had changed. There was no tension hanging in the air. No whispers about compliance reviews or frozen capital. Just printed agendas, measured voices, and policy. The item was simple. Vote on Brandon Collins' proposal to serve as a limited technical advisor under strict compliance oversight. No executive authority. No financial approval power. No control over equity transactions. The interim CEO summarized the terms calmly. All advisory contributions will be subject to dual signature verification and independent audit review. Minority consent protections remain intact. Minority consent protections. They said it like it had always mattered. Brandon sat across from me. Not at the head of the table. Not commanding the room. Just another shareholder waiting for a vote. He looked older. Not defeated. Just recalibrated. "I'm not asking for control," he said when given the floor. "Only the opportunity to contribute technically. I understand the safeguards. No dramatics. No appeals to loyalty. Just acknowledgement." 2 years ago, he would have framed it differently. He would have talked about legacy, urgency, growth, family. Now he talked about compliance. I glanced at the compliance officer. "All related party disclosures have been updated," she confirmed. "Governance reforms are fully codified in bylaws." That mattered more than apologies. I remembered the night of the email, the glow of the laptop, the missing signature, the assumption that I would stay silent. I remembered kneeling in the closet, pulling the shareholder agreement from the safe. Section 7. My name printed clearly. They had treated it like a technicality. Today, it was a structural checkpoint. The board opened discussion. An independent member spoke first. From a governance standpoint, risk appears mitigated under current safeguards. Another added, "Operational stability has improved since reforms were implemented." No one mentioned the affair. No one mentioned the divorce. No one mentioned humiliation. Only policy. Only structure. The ballots were distributed. I held mine for a moment. Not because I was conflicted, but because I understood the weight of habit. 2 years ago, my vote had been about survival. Today, it was about principle. I marked my decision. Collected ballots were counted quietly. The motion passes. The interim CEO announced, "Brandon Collins is approved for limited advisory engagement under compliance oversight." There was no applause, just acknowledgement. Brandon exhaled slowly. He didn't look triumphant. He looked careful. After the meeting, he approached me near the window overlooking downtown Houston. "Thank you," he said. "This isn't a favor," I replied. "It's governance." He nodded once. "I know." There was nothing else to say. No reconciliation. No emotional confession. Just a structural balance restored. I left the building alone. The elevator doors closed softly behind me. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers. Traffic moved steadily. The city didn't pause for personal reckonings. I drove back toward the medical center, toward the hospital where my night shift would begin in a few hours. My life had not become glamorous. I wasn't a CEO. I wasn't on magazine covers. I was still a licensed nurse working long shifts, reading vital signs, adjusting drips, listening to heartbeats. But I understood something now that I hadn't fully grasped before. Power isn't volume. It isn't anger. It isn't spectacle. Power is knowing what you signed. Power is reading the clause everyone else laughed at. Power is refusing to surrender your consent because someone assumes you won't use it. They thought my veto was symbolic. They thought marriage would silence me. They thought family loyalty would override documentation. They were wrong. I didn't destroy the company. I didn't ruin a legacy. I enforced a signature. And in doing so, I reminded them, and myself, that being a wife does not mean being excluded. And investing your money does not mean surrendering your voice. If you've ever been left out of a financial decision in your own marriage or family business, I want you to remember something. Read what you sign. Understand your rights. Never assume someone else will protect your interests for you. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't walking away. It's staying and enforcing the line you drew years ago. If this story resonated with you, share in the comments whether you've ever discovered a clause, a detail, or a truth that changed everything in your life. And if you believe knowledge is the strongest form of revenge, stay with us. Subscribe for more stories about hidden power, family drama, and the kind of justice that doesn't scream, but stands firm. Because sometimes, the biggest mistake they make is thinking you've lost your vote. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.